Good afternoon, good morning. I don't know, we're at that like weird time of day. I don't know which one to use, but hello everyone. My name's Dillon Mulroy. I am a software engineer at Formidable. And today I want to talk a little bit about event-driven Redux and kind of more broadly how we can have a better developer experience building apps with Redux. You've heard a couple speakers say already this morning about, too much boilerplate, Redux or context API. It can be better. Before we dive in, though, a little bit about Formidable. We are an engineering consultancy and open source software organization. We specialize in React, React Native, GraphQL, Node, and pretty much the greater JavaScript ecosystem. You may know us from some of our open source contributions, such as, well, my click works, Victory Charts, Spectacle, Urkel, Run Package, among many others, and we actually have some pretty exciting stuff coming down the pipeline in the next couple months. You can also find my slide deck if you want to follow along on your laptop or phone. I do have a couple code samples in here that may be easier to view on your own personal device. It's at bit.ly/event-driven-redux-ngs, or JS, excuse me. Or you can find it on my Twitter, which is at Dillon_Mulroy. To get things started, I kind of want to dive into the state of state management, and especially in context to this talk. And most importantly, I want to stress that this talk is not about why Redux. I'm not going to sit here and talk about why you should be using Redux over MobX or the context API or XState or anything like that. If you're interested in a talk like that, one of my coworkers, Becca Bailey, gave a talk at ReactConf in I think it was in Vegas this year a couple weeks ago, and she did a really thoughtful and thorough analysis on the pros and cons of all the different solutions that are out there. If you pull my slide deck, this image has a link to her YouTube video, or if you just Google or YouTube Redux or ReactConf 2019, that video should come up. First, I kind of want to pull the audience quick. How many of you in the past year or two have either seen a tweet, read a blog post or article, had a coworker or been at a meetup or something where you heard something along the lines of, Redux is dead, it's going away, it's dying, use the context API? Anyone? Come on. Yeah, I thought so. OK, you can put your hands down. How many of you are actually using Redux on a production level application right now or on a personal project? Cool. So that emphasizes my next point. Redux is not dead or going away, right? It's getting over 16 million monthly downloads. It's incredibly well known in the React ecosystem. The APIs are very well known. I mean, even with the Hooks API that recently came out, it was influenced, right? We have Modal Reducer now. This has the added benefit of being incredibly easy to hire and onboard people for, and especially onboarding juniors, right? There's so much content out there for learning how to use Redux within a React application. And probably the most important point is that Redux is battle-tested and time-proven for building and shipping production-level applications. So a little background on why I wanted to give this talk and why I kind of wanted or thought now was a good time. So Redux was released almost 5 years ago in 2015, and it pretty much quickly became like the most popular implementation of Flux, right? And with that kind of rise in popularity, it also became like the de facto standard for state management in React. And over the course of like months and years, tons and tons of content came out, right? You couldn't go to a JavaScript conference or a React conference without having talks on Redux or seeing quote unquote best practices or rules, or you have to use ducks or whatever. It just, everything built up. And I think in the process of that, a lot of context kind of was lost behind the why of Redux, or why you really want to reach for it, or why you need it. And that kind of led to like a ton of complaints that we've already heard this morning, right? Like there's too much boilerplate, there's needless verbosity, there's challenging functional programming concepts, amongst many other complaints. I started at Formidable back in July, and I onboarded onto a new client project, and the former tech lead, Stefan, had architected Redux in a way that I had never seen before. And it really, the way he had set it up reduced the amount of challenges and difficulties that we all commonly complain about Redux. And that's kind of what I want to teach you all today. But before we talk about that, I do want to kind of jump into my own experiences and talk about some of these common complaints with Redux. Actually, kind of funny enough, while I was working on putting the slide deck together, Dan Abramov, who is one of the creators of Redux and now a core member on the React team, put out a couple tweets. He said, "Reading some Redux example code I wrote 4 years ago, and I have no effing idea what's going on there." He went on to say, "Why is this stuff in 5 different files and constants shouting at me?" These are valid complaints that we've all seen, we've all heard, we've all dealt with. So I want to talk about my experiences with Redux up until starting at Formidable. So as a technical lead, it gets super frustrating because there are so many files, and this can lead to large PRs. And in my capacity as a tech lead, I'm reviewing most of my coworkers' code, and it just takes up so much time to go through. Okay, I have to look at my, my types and my actions and my action creators, my sagas, or it just gets to be so much. And then from the perspective of an individual contributor or a developer, I can explicitly remember working on previous Redux applications where I just feel burnt out and unmotivated to work on it because I got this new feature, I have to sit here, I have to make all these different files, I have to make my actions, my types, before I even get started on my UI or actually building anything productive. And then obviously just the needless verbosity. We have constants everywhere. It's why are we doing this? It makes code harder to read and follow. Another complaint, and I found myself thinking why are we even using this? This is just holding state in a store and we're just setting on it. What is really the point here? And probably my largest complaint is that the abstraction of Redux often tends to bleed into our component APIs, right? So specifically callback props have a tendency to start looking and reading our thunk actions or just the names of our actions, right? Which isn't great. The timeless question, what state belongs in Redux and what state should be local, right? So it doesn't have to be this way. We don't need to have 10 files per feature, constants yelling at us, reducers acting as setters, and Redux as an abstraction bleeding or leaking into our component or presentation layer. So the first resource I'd like to point you guys to is Mark Erickson's idiomatic Redux blog series. He's the current maintainer of Redux. And the first two I really want to emphasize is the Tau Redux Part 1 and Part 2. These are really fantastic blog posts that could warrant their own talk. It's basically an anthropological deep dive on the history and context of the what and why behind Redux. I definitely recommend checking these out later at some point. And then more recently, he put out a blog post titled Redux Toolkit 1.0, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. Also definitely worth checking out. So one of the first ways that we can make Redux have a better developer experience nowadays is using Redux Toolkit. Up until this point, the Redux team has taken a pretty hands-off approach, saying, here's this library, use it how you will. We're not going to recommend you do any particular pattern or whatever. They were just pretty hands-off. They've since changed. Redux Toolkit, or short for RTK, is now the officially recommended way to use Redux. If you go on the Redux docs, it will say use RTK. So that's a pretty big pivot from them going from, here's just this library, you can use it, to, no, you should definitely use this. It was formerly known for a hot minute as Redux Starter Kit, but they recently rebranded because they didn't want to give the impression that it was only for beginners to Redux. This is for everyone. The other nice thing about Redux Toolkit is that it's very easy to integrate into an existing project. So if you're using Redux and you're feeling the pain of boilerplate or all these other problems, install RTK and see if you like it. It's pretty minimal. It exports 4 main API functions, and that is configure store, create action, create reducer, and create slice. I'm really going to focus on create action and create reducer for the scope of this talk, but the other stuff is definitely worth checking out too. So let's look at create action first. So you can see on line 1, that's our function signature, right? It takes a type, which is a string, and then an optional prepare action callback. The prepare action callback is going to receive whatever you call your action creator with, and it's basically a way to manipulate your payload before it gets sent through the rest of Redux. And I've most commonly seen prepare action used for appending a created at timestamp or a UUID to your action payload. So if we look at line 3, right, we call create action, we give it a string. Notice we're not using all caps or constants or anything. So then when we call that, it just returns a plain JavaScript object that is our action. It has a type, counter/increment. We can call it with a payload that gets appended to the payload property, as you can see on line 9. And then something cool they've done with this create action API is that they've overwritten the toString method, which we'll see the benefit of that in a minute. And in addition, it's not on this slide, but the function that's returned from create action has a .type property on it, which will be the type you supply to it. So next up is create reducer, right? So this one takes your initial state and then an action lookup map, which is basically just a plain JavaScript object where your keys are actions, and you can actually import your actions that you used from create action and use it as the keys. Or you can reference that .type property I talked about before. And then the value on that map is just going to be your typical reducer function, right? You get your state, you get your action, you're going to mutate your state somehow. And one other nicety about create reducer is that under the covers, it's using a library called immer, which is basically it's an immutable update library that lets you write imperative and mutative code. I believe Ben was talking about like it's just easier to write and use things like push or just changing properties, right? So if we like look on line 7, we're able to use the array push method rather than like spreading our array or finding an index and slicing and all that, or copying objects, and just that adds more boilerplate too. Here we can just use simple mutative APIs, and under the covers, immer takes care of the immutability for us. So the next way to improve our Redux experience is using the React Redux hooks. I believe it was version 7 or 7.0.1 that they released their hooks, but it's pretty much use dispatch, which just gives us our dispatch function, right? Pretty simple. And then use selector, which basically gives us access to our store. And it's also compatible with reselect. And if you're not familiar with reselect, reselect is a library that lets you write memorize functions for retrieving state from the store. And also the hooks removes the need for the connect higher order component, which in my experience and opinion, like I think that's one of the worst parts of React, especially for like onboarding juniors. Like especially in most modern code bases, we don't see very many higher order components anymore, and like that implicit magic is really confusing and hard to follow. And oftentimes it's not even clear that our containers are real React components. So here's kind of a simple contrived example of like what we used to do, right? We've seen this already today. We have our map state to props, we have our map dispatch to props, and then we connect it, right? Pretty straightforward. With the hooks, we can now make functional components, right? And we just get our dispatch. We can use a selector, get the state we care about, write our callback props for our counter, and then supply it to our component, be on our way. So I'd like to dive into Redux architecture and kind of take a closer look at the different pieces of our application when we're using Redux and kind of the responsibilities each piece has and like what knowledge of the greater architecture each piece should have. So let's start with React, right? React's responsibility is to be our presentational and UI layer. This is what like our renders to the screen, our users interact with. It basically describes APIs that must be fulfilled to render meaningful data and help create interactions for our users. And in terms of knowledge of our greater system or architecture of our app, like it really should just know about itself and nothing else. It should have no knowledge of Redux or like async middleware or data fetching libraries. So now let's talk about the store. The store is responsible for storing slices of state or data, right? And then it's also responsible for composing reducers to act on that state. And in terms of knowledge of the system, our store should really only know about reducers. And kind of quickly, I want to talk about a pattern for setting up your Redux store that has worked incredibly well for my team. I like having 2 top-level properties in the store, one for entities and one for features. And the example I'm going to be using for the rest of this talk is kind of a hypothetical music management app that lets you like have playlists, add and remove songs. So just kind of bear with me on that. In this example, you can see we have 2 entities, right? And an entity is basically just like some sort of business object that's generally being stored in a database somewhere that you're getting from a REST API or GraphQL that is either going to come across the wire normalized, or when you get the response, you're going to want to normalize it and store it. So you can see in this example, we have entity/playlist, right? And it's keyed by ID. And after the ID, we just have the rest of the tuple. And for the example of playlist, we have song IDs, which would be an array of just simple IDs that would reference our other collection, entities/songs. That will help our selectors get instant lookup when we're fulfilling our component props. The other top-level piece is features, and I like to, the best way to describe features is like what your components are going to need, like a particular view in your app per se. Like you can imagine we might have like a playlist view in our app or a playlist component that needs to know what the active playlist you're currently looking at is, and if you're like doing anything with a particular song in that, like adding one, hovering one, deleting one, right? We want to know what the selected song is. Another example of this might be like a global modal. You're going to want to know if that modal is open, and if it is, what modal component we should currently be rendering. So back to the components of our architecture. So reducers. Reducers are responsible for applying state mutations to the slice of state that it kind of governs. And pretty much outside of any asynchronous middleware, our reducers should hold the majority of our business logic. The reason we want to do that is because reducers have to be, pure functions. And if we capture our business logic there, we can test very easily and be confident that our state mutations are doing what we want. In terms of knowledge of the system, reducers should know about the slice of state it acts on, and then it should also know about the actions that trigger state mutations. So up next is selectors, right? Selectors are responsible for accessing state from various slices in the store, and then also applying transformations to that extracted state to fulfill our component APIs. In terms of knowledge of the system, it's going to know about the store that it can retrieve data from, or the slice of state in the store, and then also what our component APIs and props are. So next up, containers, right? Containers are basically like responsible for just taking all of our actions and all of our selectors and state and stitching it all together and basically fulfilling the contract that our component requires for its props. And it should have knowledge of the available selectors, available actions, and then obviously our component props that it needs to fulfill. And finally, we have actions. And I think in a lot of cases, we don't put enough emphasis on the importance of actions in Redux architecture. They're easily just kind of set aside as a piece that here's our actions, we're just going to dispatch this. But really, they're really important. They're responsible for the communication between our containers, reducers, and any async middleware we have. And they're basically just plain JavaScript objects that adhere to the Flux standard action spec, which is basically just a spec that says an action must be a plain JavaScript object that has a mandatory type property and then an optional payload, error, or meta property. And then what's interesting about actions and what kind of I'm going to dive into like the heart of this talk, right, event-driven, is that our actions can have either knowledge of our reducers or knowledge of our container and our component API, but not both. So I threw together this little matrix. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. You can download my slides and look at it later, just a visual representation. Just one thing to note on it is that the rows have knowledge of the columns, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. So the first way, and this is definitely the more common way, like pretty much any blog post or tutorial you follow, you're going to see actions treated as commands. In this paradigm, our actions have knowledge of the reducers, and they're typically kind of like our reducer's API on how to interact with state, right? Where our actions like tell a reducer what to do. The type is typically seen as like verb noun, like set logged in user or set selected song or open modal or something like that. And they typically map directly one action to one state mutation in a reducer. And at least in my opinion, business logic has a tendency to leak into our containers when we treat actions this way. And I'll have an example of that in a second. And also in terms of async middleware, when we're using actions as a command as a paradigm, it pairs really, really well with Redux Thunk. So back to our music playlist, kind of a la Spotify. Let's say we have our actions right here. We have a remove from playlist, set selected song, open modal, close modal. You can imagine that we might have this playlist view, list of songs, and maybe every song has like a trash can icon that you can click on that launches a confirmation modal that you want to delete your song from the playlist, right? So let's look at our reducers, right? We have three. We've got our modal reducer, which has an open modal action it listens for, which basically just takes the name of the modal component we want to open. We have a playlist reducer, which is responsible for our playlist entity, and that listens for the removed playlist. So it will get an action with a payload with a playlist ID and a song ID, checks if we actually have that playlist, and if it does, we're going to filter out the song and remove it. And the last one is our playlist view. This tells our component basically, this is for our this would be the feature state I talked about in our store. And it's going to tell us this is the playlist we're looking at and this is the song we're currently operating on. Let's look at container. So you can imagine we might have two connected components in this application. We would have our playlist view, which our map dispatch to props might look like on remove song click, right? We'll get a song ID. We'll dispatch open modal. We want to open the remove song modal, and we want to set the selected song that we're acting on as whatever row we clicked on, right? And then once the modal opens, we're going to have a confirmation button. And then when we click yes, yes, we want to remove this song from the playlist, we're going to dispatch remove from playlist, pass in the playlist ID, the song ID. We're going to dispatch close modal, and then we're going to clear the selected song and close the modal, right? So I kind of want to focus on this multiple dispatch thing going on right here. And this is exactly what I was talking about when I said that business logic bleeds into our container. Whether you think so or not, this is implicit business logic that is incredibly hard to test, and it does not scale well. You can imagine maybe we get a new requirement down the road that when we remove a song from a playlist, we have to log to some analytic API somewhere, right? That means we have to add another dispatch to this line right here. And sure, you could abstract that away in a thunk or something, but that's still, your business logic is bleeding into the, the Redux abstraction. So now let's talk about the other paradigm, which is treating actions as events. Under this line of thinking, our actions have knowledge of our container and our component. And they describe events that have occurred, and the type is typically past tense. So you could think of this as remove clicked or drop down selected or anything of that nature, an action our user took really. And what's interesting about when we shift, even though it's just a real minor thing, if we shift our thinking here to treat it as events, our events can suddenly start mapping from one event to many reducers. And it has the added benefit of isolating the role of our containers to just simply fulfilling the component API and props. And also it pairs well with Redux Saga. And just a quick note on Redux Saga, if you haven't used it, I hadn't up to this project. I was super skeptical of generators, but the important thing you should know about Redux Saga is you can set up these things called watchers, which basically just monitor actions flowing through Redux. And when an action comes through your watcher cares about, you can react to it. And in fact, Mark Erickson had tweeted out in the last day or two that they're investigating adding a Saga-esque abstraction or API to Redux Toolkit. So I thought that was pretty interesting and timely. So let's look at the same application that we just did, although using actions as events rather than as commands. So in this case, we just need two actions, right? We're going to have the remove song clicked, right? That could be the little trash can icon on our individual song in our playlist. And then when we click the remove, the confirm remove click button in our modal. So now this is a demonstration of how multiple reducers can listen to a single action. And most specifically, I want to call out the modal reducer, right? So remove song clicked. And that's when we click on the trash can icon in our playlist view. And here, we've all of a sudden moved our business logic of what modal needs to happen into our reducer. And now it's way easier to test. Fundamentally, the reducers are all the same. They all do the same things, but we have less action. So right there, we literally cut the number of actions we needed in half. We went from 4 to 2, just by this simple mental shift. If we look at our containers, we now only have a single dispatch for each thing, which greatly simplifies things. So we kind of talked about in the actions as command model, how it doesn't really scale well. If we add new requirements in the future, we have to keep adding dispatches and reducers that map one-to-one. And the reason that treating actions as events rather than command scales well is it's kind of like a PubSub architecture, right? In PubSub, we have our publishers, which send messages or events to some sort of event bus or message queue or topic. And then we have other parts of a system subscribed to that message queue, reacting on that. So if we kind of apply this to Redux and treating actions as events, suddenly our publishers become containers, which emit actions and events. Our event bus is Redux, and our subscribers are reducers and our Redux middleware. So I want to kind of quickly talk about a way that you can apply this and a workflow for this, and I'll get you guys out to lunch here. So the way my team kind of likes to approach approach event-driven Redux is we kind of like starting with Storybook, which we've heard about already today. I've noticed on a lot of teams previously that I've been on that we have a tendency to start in the Redux kind of layer when we're building new features. Like we create our reducers and our actions first and our asynchronous side effects. But like if we start in Storybook, we can focus on what really matters, right? We can focus on our UI. We can focus on what our user is going to be interacting with. And I think this is a way more like healthy approach to like building out component APIs too. So after we build out like our just base UI, that should inform us what our props need to be. And from there, we can kind of look at our component and be like, what possible events or kind of actions could our users take on this component? And we can then start modeling those out. And from there, we can build out our container, and then finally and lastly, write our reducers and our sagas. So kind of a quick example of this. Here's our lovely remove song confirmation modal. Let's say we start in Storybook, and we're building this out, like we want to display a message like, are you sure you want to remove your song from whatever playlist? Like right up front, like we know we want a song name and we want a playlist name. So that tells us that's going to be part of our component API, right? And we also need a way to like broadcast to the rest of the system like that data. So we obviously want our song ID and our playlist ID. So there's 4 props we know we need for our component just from starting in Storybook. And then also we see we have a cancel button. So we'll need on cancel click, we'll need on remove click, and generally with modals you're going to have like on close, right? So those are also like our actions. And an add-on I like using for Storybook is the action add-on, and this kind of lets us do this thing down here, right? We can click on like the remove button and it'll log this action out, and this just becomes like a form of like self-documentation for like the possible events that our components can broadcast for Redux. So I mentioned earlier that the Redux team has, up until recently, taken a very hands-off approach on being opinionistic about how to use Redux, but that has really changed. And really in the like past month or two, they did not sure about a complete rewrite, don't quote me on that, but they did add a style guide section. And what I found was interesting, under the style guide section, they have 3 strongly recommended bullet points. The first being model actions as events, not setters. Avoid many reducers, or allow many reducers to respond to the same action, and avoid dispatching many actions sequentially. And like, this blew my mind, right? This style guide got published like, I don't know, 2.5 weeks ago. I started this slide deck and preparing for this talk like 2 months ago. So it just felt like this like nice confirmation that like, yes, I was doing the right thing. But I would definitely recommend checking out the style guide, Redux Toolkit, and the hooks. In summary, we can have a better developer experience using Redux by using the new hooks, using Redux Toolkit. And if we shift our mental model to an event-driven PubSub model with Redux, we can have fewer actions and boilerplate. We can isolate our business logic, have easier tests to write, and have more scalable code. Thank you.